So we're going to go right back into the questions, and the question was, who was responsible? Presumably there was one individual who sat down and his job in the war was to come up with names for tanks. So of course the British came up with the most names, so let's start there.
Right, well that person was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill actually got very confused when it came to talking about tanks. The British had a most confusing system. Take, for example, the Crusader over there, or the Valentine out there. The Crusader was the Cruiser Mark 6, A-15, Crusader Mark 1, 2, or 3. But before the word Crusader had come, we just got this Mark 1, 2, and 3 business. So Churchill is the one initially responsible for starting this. He also found it very confusing when the American tanks came over. He felt that the M3, the medium M3, could be confused with what we then called the Mark III or Panzer III. And so he wanted names, and he decreed that the M3 with the British turret would be the Grant, with the American turret would be the Lee, the light cavalry tank would be the Stuart, and then followed by the Sherman and so on. One proviso which gets missed out quite a lot, and it's in his memo, is that the name should not be preceded by general. So if you're prepared to obey Churchill, you do not refer to the General Sherman, the General Grant, the General Lee. He'll have you for it. The other question that we are continually asked at work is how come all British tanks start with the letter C? Well, in fact, they don't. I mean, there's the Black Prince, there's the Valentine, and all this sort of thing. They don't begin with C. However, we think that they originally elected to use the letter C as the initial letter for the name of cruiser tanks. The exception is the Churchill, but that was named after the Prime Minister, and he couldn't help it. His name began with C, so it gets landed in there anyway. But that's the basic reasoning behind it. At the end of the war, they lost the thread completely. They completely got off their heads. So after that, every tank had to begin with C. We got Centurion, we got Conqueror. There were lots of others, Conway, Carnarvon, and all others that just vanished, up to Chieftain and ultimately Challenger. In fact, Challenger, they ran out of ideas. For a start, they'd forgotten that we'd had a tank called Challenger during the war. And they got terribly upset when they rang us up and we said, well, we've had Challenger. So anyway, we had Challenger, which went to the first Gulf War, and then we now have Challenger 2. And this shows you how really good they are at coming up with names beginning with C. We actually suggested Caerphilly, because that's a castle in South Wales. They all thought it was a cheese that wouldn't go any further at all. So that's the start of it. But Vickers always gave their tanks a letter, a word, a name beginning with the letter V. So you got Valiant, Valentine, and all that sort of thing. But there's two exceptions, and they've always intrigued me. Valentine is one of them because, as far as I know, it's a person's name. And the other, which is even more bizarre, is Matilda. And why would anybody call a tank Matilda? It's like naming a tank after your favourite aunt or something. Well, it turns out I found a document in which before the very first Matilda was created, before the very first tank had appeared in metal form, someone had written across the top of the thing, code name Matilda. So this code name clearly, pardon me, came from a War Office brain. And if you study these things, and it's terribly boring, so don't, but if you study these things, Matilda in High German is something like valiant in battle. Now, that's not bad. And the word Valentine, the root of Valentine is in valens, the Latin, which means valor, valorous, and so on. So again, although they sound silly, the names actually have a reason. The weirdest one of all is Tetrarch. A tetrarch was a group of 4 in the Roman governmental system. I wrote this once in a magazine, and someone said, no, it wasn't, it was a racehorse. But in fact, that's where the racehorse's name came from, but they kind of ignored that. And the other odd one, which Nicholas mentioned, of course, is Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was President Roosevelt's special envoy to Winston Churchill. Why on earth he got a tank named after him, we don't know. A more useless tank, because we never used it for anything, you'd have to go a long way to find. But nobody seems to know how that happened, but Churchill was one of those people who liked Harry Hopkins. And he liked to sort of interfere with these things, and I think that's where that comes from. But that's the start of it.
So then, of course, the Germans had the cat names, and there were a couple. You have a personal gripe.
Yeah, I have no idea. I've never seen any documentation that said where the names Tiger and Panther came from. Hitler was actually very interested in technology, which was a bit of a problem, but he was very interested, so he did follow this stuff in great detail and didn't seem to have quite those same problems about identifying Panzerkampfwagen 3, Ausrung E, and so forth. But once the names got introduced for Tiger and Panther, there were some other ones like Lynx and Puma that were official, but then for some reason I think the modelers thought this was a great idea, and we have names like Hetzer. There has never been any such thing in the documentation from the Germans that ever said there was a vehicle called a Hetzer. Certainly not the Jagdpanzer 38 that we all know and like as the Hetzer. That name never existed, it never was used by combat troops. There was a reference to Hetzer used with one of the projects that these Panzer Commission guys were coming up with, which was the E10 project. And they used the term Hetzer for that. And we think maybe post-war somebody mixed up this name and it got mixed in. The other one that never existed in the German usage was Bumbar. For the Germans called it a Sturmpanzer IV, which is what it was. And it was never referred to by the troops. But then again, there is an article in one of the very late Signal magazines that does mention names for the vehicles, but that was a propaganda exercise, nothing to do with what the troops knew.
And of course, you found that wonderful document in the archives.
I didn't bring it today, but yes, although we did name the Chaffee, finally, it got off on made our own beginning, but around to the Ordnance Technical Committee, the acting chief of Ordnance wrote a memo about 1952 saying, will someone please explain to me why we can't come up with a nice name other than these terrible technical alphanumerics for our equipment items so that the public can really get an appreciation and tell them apart. And I've been asking for this for many years, but now the Chief of Staff wants to know, so it better be a good answer. So the change seems to have been, judging from the naming some really odd names, such as naming the M47 the Patton 47, which never caught on with anyone, and they named the Scorpion, the little self-propelled 9-inch tank gun. It finally got underway in the U.S. Army, and the change seems to have been either from the R&D department or maybe from the user. It came to the Ordnance Committee, which kind of blessed it and set it on to the Chief of Staff, and I suspect the Secretary of the Army probably had at least approved it, didn't initiate it, but these had to be approved probably at the Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Army level. Today, I'm convinced it's Secretary of Defense level for the final approval for these kinds of things.
But you have to hand it to Buick's PR team with Hellcat. They actually got their name in on it. I mean, maybe the only tank destroyer that actually was called something, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other ones had no names. Contrary to some of the, not so much from the wargaming folks, but from the modeling community, there's a lot of invented names out there. You'll see names for the M36 like Jackson, things like that. No, there was no Slugger, no official names for any of those. There's a lot of unofficial names that you occasionally do see in the documents. So I'll give you an example. The M4A3E2 assault tank, the Sherman with the extra armor, you oftentimes hear it referred to as Jumbo. That was never any sort of official name, and it actually only got started by a Signal Corps photo. And it said, and we have here a picture of a Jumbo tank, Jumbo with a small J. And somebody somewhere picked up on that, and suddenly the M4A3E2 is called Jumbo. And I'm sure it's the same thing with Slugger. Jackson, I think, is actually an invention, perhaps, of Tamiya models. Back in the 1960s or 70s, when they were coming out with kits, they were familiar with Sherman and Stewart and that, and so they wanted to have a name to stick on their American vehicles. And as a result, I think that they invented some of these, because there's a number of names out there that just don't have any connection. And it was the same thing in the 1950s when some of the model companies came out with, for example, the M40 155 millimeter self-propelled gun. Back in the days when they were developing it, one of the vehicles down at Aberdeen Proving Grounds had a big thing painted on the side, Big Shot. And so the kit company started calling the M40 the Big Shot. Well, I understand where it comes from, but it's not an official name the way the Chaffee is or Sherman or that sort of thing. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. Army didn't use the British names during World War II. I mean, we all know what a Sherman is, we all know what a Stewart is. You will not find very many U.S. documents that say Sherman. I've never seen the word Sherman in any kind of after action report by a unit. I haven't seen it in any of the RDT&E documents. You occasionally see it with people who are familiar with the British names. I mean, there were plenty of American officers dealing with their British counterparts, and they're undoubtedly familiar with the names. But it was not common until after the war, and it was common after the war because the American press picked up on it. As Ken was pointing out, a lot of people get confused with M3 light tank, M3 medium tank, all that sort of thing, and the press gets confused. And so they start picking up the British names. They knew the British names from the battles of El Alamein and that sort of thing. So it's the American press that starts popularizing the name Stewart, the name Sherman, but certainly not the U.S. Army. I mean, we know it now is that, but that's not the case back then.
Nor were the troops referring to them at
Right.
all as Shermans. The M4 crews called them either M4s or mediums, and that's all.
Yeah, it's very frustrating when you're researching, looking for these after-action reports, as they're called in English, but Erfahrungsberichte in the German terminology, and you read these great reports, but all the guys ever refer to is unser Wagen, our wagon. And that's it. You don't know whether it's a Panzer IV or a Tiger. You're meant to know that the Vierte Aufklärungsabteilung had such and such a wagon. They didn't ever tell you.
What is interesting, though, is that in German after-action reports, they refer to the Sherman.
Yes.
We didn't, they did.
Yeah.
All right, go on.
Yeah, David mentioned the fact we've got Challenger 1, Challenger 2, and we've already had a Challenger 17-pounder before. Part of the reason we ended up with Challenger 1 was it was announced in BOR that we were going to get a new tank to replace Chieftain. They even produced a glossy brochure to show us what it was going to be like, how much had been spent. And we had a visit from the MOD who said, what we want is you guys on the ground to feel part of the team that's developing the tank. To that end, we're going to run a competition for you people to come up with a name that's different and original for the tank. So this competition duly went ahead. I think there's a £500 prize as well. The winner was a guy, a warrant officer second class from the 47th Dragoon Guards, and he came up with the real original name of Challenger. And the MOD accepted it. Having got that, why they accepted it again for Challenger 2, I don't know. But that's why we got Challenger 1 the second time round.
The basic layout was used to have 4 troops, 3 cents. So they would either give you 4 Conquerors to the squadron, and you'd have it as the 4th tank in a troop, or you'd have 1st, 2nd and 3rd were Centurion, and 4th troop was what they called heavy troop, and that would have 3 conks.
Well, before you touched them out, though, they had their own parent squadron, right, that they belonged to and trained together as, or were they always attached out?
They became part of the vehicles for the regiment.
Okay.
It wasn't a specialist crew or anything.
No.
You went away, did your Conqueror course, came back, and you were posted to Conqueror troop.
Okay, so your regiments were mixed from the beginning of Conqueror and Centurion.
Yeah.
I see. So no Conqueror squadrons?
Oh no.
Okay.
No. I mean, a lot of regiments, even to the day they got rid of them, never actually got their full entitlement either. So you might have had a Conqueror troop with 3 tanks instead of having 4 tanks. So there was a shortage. But again, like I was saying yesterday, it's 50-50. A hell of a lot of people I interviewed swore by this.
Oh, sure.
It's faster than Centurion. It's fuel injected.
Armor, unbeatable.
it will go where Centurion will not go.
Amazing.
Because you've got an 810 brake horsepower engine and you've got those whacking great ride tracks, and she'll go everywhere. Other people sort of said, I used to hate Salto, get the conch out, break down, 2 weeks later, picked up, go home.
Nah.
Horses for courses. You know, but most people seem to have a soft spot for it.
Same as the 103 guys.
And, you know, the stories I've heard are fantastic, like going through German towns, this thing, because it's metal tracked and metal wheels, and it used to rattle the cobbles.
And the houses.
Oh, yeah.
It would be jumping up and down.
But when it's working, to watch it fire is quite impressive, because you've got the gun, recoils, the flash, and then if you look on that side, you can see the door open, and the case is thrown out.
Out it goes, yeah.
So, yeah, it's brilliant.
All right, I'm going to change gears here and go on to what I know has got to be your favorite subject ever. Given I have heard you speak with great passion about your opinion on this device, the Rotatrailer.
Where did that come from?
I mean, it sounds like a good idea at the beginning. I mean, we've all seen M4s towing extra ammunition, and of course, there's nothing wrong with towing fuel behind, because that's what the Sherman Crocodile did. So, why does the Rotatrailer have such a place in your heart?
Okay, that's useless. Put it in perspective to begin with. I firmly believe that no tank should ever be expected to pull a trailer. It is asking for trouble, and going backwards is a nightmare. But among all these things, the Rotatrailer is an exception. It is totally useless, pulled or pushed in any direction. If you've never come across one, or ever seen one, it's a metal box with no springs, you wouldn't want springs, and the container that the box consists of has compartments for ammunition, one compartment for a fuel pump, and the wheels, which have solid rubber tires on them, are hemispherical discs that you fill with fuel. So you tow this thing behind your tank, you've got fuel, you've got a pump to pump the fuel into the tank, and you've got ammunition bouncing about in this lovely metal box. They have 3 problems with it. First of all, the wheels leak. So just when you need it, there's no gas left in the wheels. Secondly, because it has no springs, it bounces over every stone or rut it can find until the ammunition is so bent and battered you can't use it. And they said the worst thing of all was after a while it will bounce 3 or 4 times and turn upside down. That would twist the rod that was holding it onto the tank, make it nearly impossible to detach it. So you've now not only crippled the tank, it's got nothing to move with or fight with. So yeah, that's my favourite reason for hating them, if you like. Incidentally, I met an elderly American officer at Bovington a few years ago, and he belonged to a unit, which was an Anglo-American unit, and it was what they'd done. They'd trawled the army for farm boys, and the idea was that these guys would go over in the wake of the invasion forces and get the harvest in. They obviously didn't know the French because they were already out there ploughing and harvesting while the battle's going on, more or less. But these guys were issued with Rotatrailers to go with their tractors to give them fuel. But that's the only account I've ever heard of anyone actually being issued with them and for a while, having never had to test them, actually liking them.
I bet I was going to say Covenanter, didn't you?
I had a feeling that was coming somewhere else.
Well, speaking of great disasters, I mean, I guess you have to mention the Valiant. Or a Valiant effort, was it?
No, it's hideous. Again, as Rob was saying, there are 2 Valiants, both by Vickers. The one we have in the museum was an assault tank evolved in about 1944-45. And I have in the archive a fabulous report by the officer responsible for the first trials. And basically there were 3 faults. They all affect the driver. Fault 1 is that if your foot were to accidentally slip between the accelerator and clutch pedal, the only way to get you out of the tank is to remove your foot. There's no way to get at the pedals with a person in there. Secondly, the rim around the hatch is very effectively set up to catch you in the back of the skull. So the slightest bump and you get a big piece of steel whacking you in the head. The third problem they found was if you put it into reverse, it's a 4-speed, a reverse gearbox, the gear lever goes so far over to the right, you need a crowbar to get it out again. To his credit, the officer who supervised the trial, after they'd done 11 miles, he called the trial off. This thing is useless, I'm not having this. And from then on, until it came to us at the museum, the tank used to be kept in a shed, and they would get it out and park it in front of a bunch of officers and say, right, here you go, how many faults can you find? And that was the only use it ever had. It's a hideous thing. But it's interesting, looking at the JS3, the Pike, with that welded nose, there is a similarity there, and you wonder if the problem was the same. So that's something I've got to investigate next.